Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. When I received an email about a year ago this time from our person who coordinates the program in London, who said that she had identified somebody to teach the London program for us, I had no idea that she had found such an accomplished person, and that he would be here today. When the students looked you up online after they had their first class, they came and said, "Wow, he does. He does so much." So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Blick, who teaches for his day job at King's College in London. He's the author of numerous books, one about the Magna Carta and another about the Code of the Constitution that has just come out. But tonight he's going to talk to us about Brexit. And he thanked me when he got here that we had provided for him an election just before he arrived. And so I look forward to hearing your remarks. Thanks for coming, Andrew.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be there. Has there been an election? I heard something about that.
We used to call them.
Yeah. I hope you get another one again one day as well. There's
Soon.
yeah, the title. Well, you can do that in the UK. It's harder.
Calm down.
So I'm here to talk about the meaning of Brexit. We had a vote in the UK, as you may have heard about that, on 23rd of June. It was a referendum. I'll get on to the significance of referendums in a bit, on whether or not the UK should remain within or leave the European Union. And by a margin of, I think, 51.9% to 48.1%, the voters voted for leave. So it was a narrow majority in percentage terms. It was about 1 million votes in absolute terms. So in that sense, it was a significant number of people, and they had voted for leave. However, that wasn't really the end of the issue. In many ways, it was the beginning of the issue, and there are still very many unanswered questions about what Brexit actually means. Brexit, as it's called, I'll use that term. I don't particularly like it, but it seems to have entered into common usage, so I'll use it. I think it's short for British exit from the EU. But what does Brexit actually mean is a question that still hasn't been fully answered and may not be answered actually for many years to come. But that's hence the title of my talk. I'd like to talk about the different meanings of this concept from different perspectives, and try and, if not to answer the questions, to at least try and clarify what the issues at stake are a bit more. I'm going to start by talking about, from a historical perspective in particular, what it means for the UK and its external orientation, what it means for the foreign policy or the international policy of the UK, its relationship with the outside world. Then I'm going to talk about what it means internally, what the domestic significance of Brexit is for the UK. Then I'm going to talk about the way in which this Brexit decision was taken and the way in which it might be implemented. And then finally, I'm going to speculate a little bit about what it might actually all turn out to be, what the actual outcomes might be, and draw some broader conclusions and try and place it in a bit more of an international global perspective. So to begin with, what does Brexit mean from the perspective of the place of the UK in the world? To try and understand this, it's really useful, I think, to have a historic perspective on this. What is the UK? What kind of a state is the UK? What is its relationship with the continent of which it is a part, the European continent of which it is a part? What is its relationship with the wider world? That relationship is, and has always been, complicated, and I'm sure it will carry on being complicated even if we do leave the European Union, the issues I'm going to talk about now have been around a long while before the European Union existed, and they will carry on being so for such time as we remain part of the European continent, which is for a long while to come, I should imagine. So we cannot escape, and that's point number one really, we can't escape being a European country, though some people might like to in the UK. That the fact is that's where we are and that's what we are. We don't always fully understand that in the UK, and even during the EU referendum campaign, people often talked about it's a referendum on whether we should leave Europe. Well, we can't really leave Europe. That's not really on the agenda. We can possibly leave the European Union, although that's going to be difficult enough. But leaving Europe isn't going to happen. But people often conflate the two and also talk about the UK as though it's not really part of Europe, or as though being part of Europe is some kind of optional extra that we can take or leave. We are part of Europe. We've always been part of Europe. We're always going to be part of Europe. But what our position is within Europe is a different matter. So what has our position been in Europe? Obviously, geographically, we're an island, or rather a collection of islands, an archipelago. There's Great Britain, there's the island of Ireland, which has sometimes been wholly part of the United Kingdom. Part of it, the north, we'll talk about that more later, is still part of the United Kingdom for the time being. And then there are various other smaller islands. So with this collection of islands off the coast of European mainland, how important has it been being an island? It is sometimes held to be very significant that it makes Great Britain or the United Kingdom somehow different from the rest of Europe, that it's isolated us from the rest of Europe. Shakespeare famously talked about this England, this sceptred isle, that kind of thing. It's a kind of a fortress protected by the Silver Sea, that we're insulated from what goes on in the continent. And that's informed a lot of political thought, and has informed British political culture. Obviously, it's important when we talk about Britain, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom, to be aware that they didn't even begin to come into existence until 1706, 1707, with the union between England and Scotland. So when Shakespeare was writing, clearly he was writing about England, and that's the word he would have used. And often England and the United Kingdom are kind of used as interchangeable, particularly by English people. They're not, but that's another story. But the relationship between this collection of islands and the continent is interesting. What is the significance of this sea barrier? Well, some people say it's helped us to not be invaded on several occasions. That's true up to a point. Certainly Napoleon never successfully invaded. The Germans never successfully invaded in the First World War. Hitler never successfully invaded. And the existence of the sea barrier played a part in that non-invasion. On the other hand, in earlier times, certainly in pre-modern times, it was actually easier to mount an invasion over sea than it was over land. There weren't roads, there weren't the kind of vehicles that can travel on land. So in some ways it could be easier to invade. And certainly we were invaded a lot in earlier periods. We were invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, we were invaded by the Romans to begin with, we were invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, they invaded by the Vikings repeatedly, invaded by the Normans famously. And then people say we're never invaded again from 1066. Well, even that's not really entirely true. There were certainly French landings subsequently. Dutch sailed up the Thames on occasions. And also some people would argue that what gets called the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is better described as a Dutch invasion, that the Dutch actually invaded a kind of early form of humanitarian intervention operation, that we'd become basically a failed state that kept on having civil wars and revolutions and ethnic conflict and couldn't govern ourselves properly, and so the Dutch actually had to come in and impose their more kind of liberal intervention and impose their form of government on us, which was more limited government. And certainly that was William of Orange's manifesto before he came over, that he had distributed, that he was going to govern according to the principles that were prevailing in the United Provinces at the time, and not the Stuart absolutist approach. So yes, being an island is significant. Yes, it has meant we haven't been invaded. Yes, at times it may have separated us from the continent, but it's not quite as straightforward as that, and the sea sometimes has actually facilitated invasion. Again, people also say, well, we've been isolated from the kind of political revolutionary upheavals that have taken place in the mainland continent. Well, again, I suppose 1848 we didn't have a revolution, although there were certainly some problems in Britain during that time, and later revolutions didn't take place. However, we have had a lot of discontinuity over time, and often it's claimed, particularly by the kind of Whig school of history, that it's all been about unbroken progression without drastic interruptions or breaks in the system. Well, actually, when you look a bit closer at English and British history, it's much harder to sustain that claim in practice. And an incident like Magna Carta, for instance, was after all the product of an uprising against the king. It was something he had to agree to, because otherwise there was going to be a more full civil war. And later on, clearly, we had a revolution, or maybe two revolutions, or whatever you want to call them, in the 17th century, and even got rid of the monarch for a while. So there are lots of breaks in the continuity. So all of that is to say, there are some ways in which we have a cultural and political distance from the continent, the mainland continent, but there are other ways in which we're very closely connected to it. Another argument that's often held up is, well, what about the break with Rome under Henry VIII? Doesn't that amount to a kind of distancing from the continent? Well, again, we weren't the only country in which Protestantism was happening at the time, and in a way, by adopting that particular side in the dispute that was developing, we actually engaged ourselves more with the mainland continent, because we had to take the side of that particular part of the conflict. And there was certainly a kind of a doctrine appearing at the time that you're supposed to, a bit like the kind of responsibility to protect doctrine of today, that you've actually got a responsibility to get involved militarily if there's persecution going on. If Catholics are persecuting Protestants in some part of Europe, we've actually got to take part in that conflict. And certainly during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, there was huge debate in England about what we should be doing. Shouldn't we be getting involved in this? Shouldn't we be doing something to stop the Habsburgs from achieving dominance in the mainland continent? John Donne's For Whom the Bell Tolls, that whole thing he wrote there was partly inspired by his experiences taking part in what became the 30 Years' War, and his view that, we're part of the whole. We're part of the continental mainland, we've got to participate. And all of that argument actually helped trigger in the end, led on to what became the revolution, overthrowing of Charles I. So being Protestant, again, didn't necessarily separate us from the mainland continent, but it's an argument that gets held up. And in a way, whether it's true or not, people have believed that kind of thing, and so therefore it's significant in its own right. So we've had all of that attitude as a kind of a backdrop. Then, as I've already said, Napoleon doesn't successfully invade, so some people in Britain regret that didn't happen. I won't comment. But he didn't successfully invade, and the impact that he had in other parts of Europe wasn't had in Britain. That's certainly the case. So again, that may have been a difference, and also creates an attitude that we're better than everybody else, which kind of has a bit of mileage even today. I'm sure most countries have that attitude in some way, but we've certainly got it in the UK. Then after Napoleonic Wars, partly out of luck, Britain becomes the dominant imperial power worldwide. And clearly this again has an important cultural impact on Britain and its view of itself and its role in the world. And the idea being that, certainly, and this is an idea that pervades well into the 20th century, even to the present, that actually our outlook isn't about our immediate neighbours, our immediate continent. We're actually focused on the whole world, and we're trading with the whole world. We're not as bothered about what's going on in Europe. Again, that doesn't reflect the realities of what was happening even at the time, and in a way, having an empire showed how European we were, because all right, we had the biggest empire, but there were other European countries who were doing the same thing. It was a European thing to do, have these colonial empires. We happened for various reasons to end up with the biggest one, but it was a European thing to do. And one of the reasons we ended up with an empire was it was a kind of an extension of the competition going on between different countries in Europe anyway. So all of those arguments have two sides to them, but it does certainly create a kind of outlook in the UK that means we might not be as amenable to a continental integration project when one actually comes about. But even that isn't quite as straightforward as it sounds, because within British political thought, there's a very strong tradition of federalism. You know, some of the leading federalist thinkers are British people, or living in Britain, or writing in Britain, or however you want to depict it. People like Lord Acton, people like John Stuart Mill talks about federalism, talks about federal theory quite a lot. Various other people. There's a historian, John Seeley, who at one point in the 19th century calls for the creation of a United States of Europe, with Britain taking part in it. So there's a tradition of federal thought in Britain. Now, that federal thought has a variety of applications. Some people who advocate federation think there should be a federal Britain, that this should be a way of keeping Ireland within the UK. That's one stream. Another group of federalists, and these people overlap with each other, but another stream of federalist thought is that we should have a federal empire, that the way of holding the empire together, particularly from the late 19th century, is by turning it into a federation, and there may even be a federal parliament to which initially what used to be called the white bits of the empire, i.e. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, will send representatives to that federal parliament. There's some qualms about the idea of India taking part, partly because, I'm sure partly for racist reasons, but also partly because the size of the Indian population would mean if they had representation commensurate with their population in the federal parliament, they would completely dominate, so it might not work. But either way, there's an idea of a federal empire. Obviously comes to nothing, it's not really workable. And other people criticise this, saying, well, a federal empire is kind of a contradiction in terms. You can't be a federation and an empire, you're one or the other. But that idea does do the rounds, and certainly a lot of quite significant people adhere to it in British society at the turn of the 19th, early 20th century. Then there's an idea of some kind of English-speaking federation does the rounds as well. And there's an American journalist called Clarence Strite talks about, in the 1930s, about a federation which will incorporate the Western democracies as he sees it, America, Britain perhaps. And the idea is that it will actually be able to create a bloc which will resist the dictatorships. That's an idea that gains ground, obviously, as the Second World War's approaching. At the same time, in Britain, we begin to promote the idea, an organisation called Federal Union, which still functions now from the late 30s, promotes the idea that there should be some kind of European federation, again, to resist fascism. There should be a federation of some kind starting with France and Britain merging into a single state. So this idea isn't completely alien to Britain. In some ways, it's driven some of the early ideas of European federalism are driven from Britain, and something which is often forgotten is that shortly after Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, France is being overrun by the Germans. To try and keep France in the war and stop them from surrendering, he proposes that the French government goes into exile, probably in Morocco, and has what's called an indissoluble union with Britain, that Britain and France actually be merged into a single state and have pooled sovereignty, pooled governmental decision-making bodies. So Churchill actually offers this to the French. French cabinet doesn't accept it. They get rid of Reynaud and Pétain takes over, and you know we know the rest that happens there. But this offer is made by Churchill, so it shows, admittedly in very desperate circumstances, we are willing to countenance the idea of some kind of European integration. However, there's also a lot of resistance to the idea, and then after the Second World War, when the European integration movement starts to gain in momentum, partly because there's a desire not to repeat the experience of the Second World War. When this idea starts to, or there's lots of other reasons for European integration, that's one of them, but when it starts to gain in momentum, Britain has a complicated attitude towards it. It's not necessarily completely hostile to it. At times, it seems to want to encourage it, but when it comes to the actual idea of pooling sovereignty, that we might somehow have to share control of economic policy, of lawmaking power, there's a tendency to draw back from that. And that may be partly as a consequence of all these other tendencies I've talked about. So countries like France, West Germany as it then was, although they're no less patriotic than we are in Britain or anywhere else, they've all got their own particular political traditions. There seems to be, for various reasons, a greater willingness to countenance the idea of taking part in supranational institutions that might transfer sovereignty to a higher body that supersedes the states themselves. And it's hard to say exactly why that is, but some of the reasons I've suggested might be at the root of it. I can see how for France, given what they've been through, the idea of some kind of entity that might be able to restrain Germany as it recovers after the war was quite attractive. I can see how for the smaller states in Europe it might look like a good idea. After all, they don't have the same kind of great power, lasting aspirations of great power status that maybe Britain or perhaps France might have. I can see how for West Germany the idea, particularly after the war, of joining an organisation that might offer it a kind of way back into acceptance as a member of the kind of international club of nations might be a good way for Germany to rehabilitate itself, why they saw it like that. For Britain, which hadn't actually been occupied during the Second World War, maybe it doesn't look quite as urgent as it does to those other countries. But there are reasons in the end that we do join. And they're again, complicated reasons. The context at the time is, of course, after the Second World War's finished, the Allies in that war, at the end of the war, start to fall out with each other. And as we know, the Cold War starts to develop. That provides more impetus for European integration at times. The US are quite keen on European integration. They want to see Europe kind of get its act together, politically unify, offer a kind of partnership rather than being an entity which the US has to keep intervening in to sort out when it gets into a war. But why Britain? Why does Britain turn around in particular by the end of the 50s and early 60s and start to look at the idea that it might want to join in with European integration? A reason for that is perceived national decline, particularly from the late 50s, when we start to realise we haven't got an empire any longer, we're not a great power any longer in the way that we were. We can't pursue, particularly after the Suez Crisis in 1956, we realised we can't pursue an independent foreign policy if it's something the US doesn't want us to do. So we've lost a lot of power, and it's not quite clear how we're going to go forward. So we start to change our minds on that. And we also see that it looks like Germany and France are achieving very rapid economic growth rates. And by being outside of the EEC, we're missing out on something. So that's the reason we end up changing our position. We don't actually manage to join until 1973. We get vetoed by de Gaulle twice before we're actually allowed to join. But that's the reason it turns around. But that shows that in some ways we were reluctant about the whole thing. So in a way, the reasons we joined were relatively negative ones, and the whole experience of joining, being rejected twice, probably wasn't particularly enjoyable one for Britain. So that's a lot of background as to what this might mean, what leaving means about our place in the world. It does suggest that we haven't fully overcome some of those attitudes, even though we're in very changed circumstances. Certainly some of the people in the Leave campaign do have, it sometimes gets called imperial nostalgia, whatever you want to call it. They do have an attitude that Britain has still got some kind of global role. They don't necessarily articulate particularly clearly what it is, but they do seem to think that Britain has relationships with its former empire. That's why we saw recently Theresa May, British Prime Minister, flying out to India. That's a good example that we think we've somehow got this relationship with the Commonwealth, with the former empire, maybe with the English-speaking world as well, including the US, that's different to the one that other European countries have with those countries, and that somehow that's something we can exploit, and that somehow being in the European Union was preventing us from fully realising these opportunities, and that once we're out of the European Union, we're going to be able to realise them. Now, I've got, as may be apparent, I don't really personally buy any of that, but it's certainly an attitude which exists. And obviously the people with this attitude are now some of the people who who've got what they want. So their outlook has to be taken seriously, at least in as far as they're going to try and pursue it or see that it is pursued. So that's what this means for Britain and its place in the world from a historic perspective, that it's a kind of reversion or continuation of those attitudes that we're not quite a European power, we're something else. Although there is an acceptance from some of the people who leave, they will often say, well, look, the EU isn't synonymous with Europe. We can be a European power without being in the EU. But nevertheless, why is it we don't want to be in the EU? Why haven't we? Well, I think we partly have to look to our past to understand that. So then, getting on second to what does this mean domestically, and a lot of this question links to the previous question, because being in the European Union or its precursors, the European communities, was always very divisive. The idea of joining was divisive. Once we joined, the idea of staying in it was divisive. We've been here before with a referendum. We had one in 1975, about 2.5 years after we first acceded on January the 1st, 1973. We had a referendum on continued membership in June 1975. So it shows how controversial it's been. I don't think any other country has had one referendum on whether they should stay within it, unless you count Greenland, which are slightly different circumstances, but certainly not to have had two. So we've already had one referendum. It shows how controversial it's been, and also it's a cross-cutting issue, by which I mean it's an issue which divides political parties internally quite severely. It's been one of the most divisive issues there has ever been in British politics. Just as in the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries, the issue of what should British policy be towards the continental mainland was incredibly divisive, so has the issue of whether or not we should be in the European Union, or what our terms of membership should be, or whether we should be in the single currency. All those kind of issues been incredibly divisive, and they've split parties. The Labour Party was chronically split over this issue, particularly in the 1970s and into the 1980s. The party that first held the referendum in 1975 was the Labour Party, and that was done mainly because Labour was so internally divided over the issue that it couldn't agree within itself. It couldn't even agree within the Labour cabinet. So the only way to try and make the issue go away was to hold a referendum. And that's historically the reason, and I'll get back to this, but the reason referendums tend to happen in the UK, I don't know why they happen in other countries, but I wouldn't recommend them, by the way, as a way of taking decisions. For what I mean, I know you have them at certain levels, but definitely you don't want to have them at a whole US level, would be my advice for what it's worth. But the reason they seem to happen is because there's a problem that's not necessarily a problem for the country as a whole, but a problem internally for the party that happens to be in power at the time. So they're held generally for reasons of party political convenience, and certainly that's why we have one in 1975. Labour Party and Labour government can't agree over whether or not we should carry on being in the European Economic Community. Harold Wilson has a renegotiation of terms of membership of the EEC, just like David Cameron did more recently. Decides that the terms he's got are really good, so he's able to recommend that we remain within the EEC. Some people say actually the terms didn't amount to much, but he's decided he's got good terms. Why would he do anything different? And on that occasion, successfully wins a yes vote to remaining in. And I think that's important, because I think David Cameron in 2016 had learnt the wrong lesson from Harold Wilson, that this tactic could work, that you could have a kind of relatively trivial renegotiation of terms of membership, decide that you'd got a really good deal, recommend a yes vote, and get enough people who are kind of mainstream political influential figures and celebrities and respected public figures to back you up, and you would get a yes vote. I think we're in different times now to where we were in 1975, and that kind of thing doesn't necessarily work as well. So, but it goes to show how divisive an issue it is. And Labour, in the end, having held that referendum, it doesn't really make the European issue go away for the Labour Party. And Labour Party ends up splitting in the early 1980s, partly over the issue of Europe, and it enters the 1983 general election, having held a referendum on continued membership, which got a yes vote. In the 1983 general election, they run for office. They were never going to win, incidentally, but this was in their manifesto. They say that we're going to leave the EEC without even holding a referendum. We're just going to leave if we win this election. So clearly, the referendum didn't really settle the issue, and it didn't stop Labour from splitting. So that could have been the lesson that David Cameron might have chosen to have drawn, but he didn't. So it's very divisive for Labour. It's also divisive for the Conservative Party, particularly from the early 1990s onwards. Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990, in some ways was a European integrationist, and she was one of the drivers of the Single European Act of 1986, which really created the single European market, and it was introduced partly because she wanted it. However, later on she increasingly goes off the idea of the European Union. It's seen by sections of the right in Britain increasingly as a kind of a socialist plot, which isn't actually, for me, a terribly plausible interpretation. Nevertheless, this idea was taken seriously, and it turns a lot of people on the right against the European Union, particularly within the Conservative Party. So you get a growing group within the Conservative Party who are probably never ever actually a majority within the Conservative Party, and I don't think they're a majority within the Conservative Party even now, but this group are very keen on, very anti-European Union. In the end, they come to favour leaving the European Union altogether. And what's interesting about them is they're kind of so focused on a single issue, and they will not back down on it, that the other people who are less hostile to European integration in the Conservative Party think they can be bargained with, think if you give them a bit of what they want, if you give them some kind of concessions, if we get certain opt-outs from European Union agreements, like things like the Schengen Agreement on free movement, if you give them a few scraps like that, you'll somehow make the problem go away. But that tactic doesn't work. Successive Conservative Prime Ministers try to do it, including David Cameron, and it doesn't work. And this group will accept nothing other than a referendum on continued membership. And in the end, after various attempts are made to buy them off in other ways, that's what they get. And as we know, they win that referendum. And had they not won that referendum, I don't think they would have given up at that point either. And what's interesting, although he wasn't a Conservative, is that on the night of the referendum in 2016, Nigel Farage, leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, his first speech was a concession speech. Opinion poll companies seem to get things wrong sometimes, and they initially called some of them called the referendum as producing a Remain vote. So Farage's first speech was a concession of defeat speech. After that, he made about another 3 victory speeches, but his first speech was a concession of defeat speech, in which he said, in so many words, we've lost a battle, but we haven't lost the war. In other words, he wasn't going to accept that was a final defeat. So now it's quite interesting that he demands that the Leave vote is accepted as final. That wasn't his position when he thought it was a Remain vote. Anyway, to get back to the divisive nature of this issue, so it's divisive in terms of party politics. It's also turned out to be a very divisive issue, as we see from the vote, in many other ways. One, it's divisive in terms of, if we look at voting patterns, in terms of age groups, older people tended to vote, were much more likely to vote Leave, younger people much more likely to vote Remain. That's one nature of the division. And some of these divisions may sound familiar from the election you just had, that there's also a division along in terms of level of education, that people with university degrees are far more likely to vote Remain than people without university degrees, also skews along socioeconomic lines. And then also another real problem has been the divisions in terms of territorial voting patterns. So, and this is the most problematic one of all, is that Scotland and Northern Ireland both vote Remain, and Greater London votes Remain, but the real problems are in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But England, outside Greater London, votes Leave, as does Wales. And because England is so much larger than the rest of the UK, and that's incidentally one reason why it's very difficult to create a federal constitution for the United Kingdom because England is so large, it makes up about 85% of the population. You couldn't, how would you make that work as a federal system? How would you represent England? But that's an issue we may have to tackle in the future in the UK. But the problem there is that, particularly in Northern Ireland, that there's a land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. What exactly is going to happen? At the moment, that's an open border, and it needs to be because of the peace process that you can't introduce a patrolled border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland without serious repercussions for the peace process and also for the economies of the North and the Republic, that they both trade with each other to a huge amount. So this is a real problem. And just the practicalities of a land border, they're really difficult. So various solutions have been proposed to that particular problem. None of them look particularly credible to me, so we'll see what can be come up with in regards to that. And then Scotland votes to remain as well. Now, as you may well know, in 2014 we had an independence referendum in Scotland that was won by about 55% wishing to remain in the United Kingdom. Although it was a win, it didn't look like one because the independence vote was much, much higher than anyone was predicting, say, 6 months out. And some polls, I think at least one poll had even shown not that long before the vote a narrow lead for the leave the UK side of the vote. So Scotland's in a difficult position there because during that independence referendum, the pro-union side of the referendum, the people who wanted Scotland to vote to remain within the UK, made one of their key planks of their campaign that if you vote to leave the UK, your membership of the European Union will come into doubt. The only way you can guarantee that you're going to carry on being members of the European Union is if you remain within the United Kingdom. Now, even by the point that they were making that claim, David Cameron had already committed himself in, I think, 2012, that if he won the next election, he'd hold a referendum on European Union membership. So the fact is now Scotland were told that to remain within the United Kingdom was the only way to carry on being members of the European Union. Well, now it looks like the opposite is the case, and Scotland has voted to remain within the European Union. The UK as a whole has voted to leave. How do we resolve that? Well, what may happen in Scotland is there may be a second independence referendum. The polling initially after the referendum suggested there was a surge in support for independence. That's tailed off a bit subsequently, so we'll see what happens. But certainly the chances of there being another referendum were increased significantly by the results in the EU referendum in 2016. And it shows how divisive an issue this is for the United Kingdom, and the problems for the Northern Ireland peace process, I say, in some ways even more grave, because we really don't want to get back to the position we were in Northern Ireland 20, 30, 40 years ago when the United Kingdom was there were more violent deaths in the United Kingdom than any other state in Western Europe. It was what was effectively was a civil war going on there. We don't really want to go back there, but we are jeopardising it. I'm not saying we necessarily will go back there, and I certainly hope we don't, but we're certainly doing something which might jeopardise the peace process. So that's something we have to be aware of. What else does it mean internally? Well, I suppose another important thing to bear in mind is that the European Union isn't just another international organisation of which we're members. The UK are members of lots of international organisations, all very important: United Nations, NATO, so on and so forth, World Trade Organisation, etc., etc. However, the difference with the European Union is their laws are incorporated directly into our legal system. So law produced by the institutions of the European Union has to be enforced by the domestic courts in the UK, and European law takes precedence over all other domestic UK law. Particularly, and this may be another reason why it's been quite difficult for the UK to adjust to the idea of being within the European Union, is that this is an unusual arrangement, in particular for the UK, because, quite famously, we don't have a written constitution. So to us, before 1973, the idea that some laws took precedence over other laws, and the idea that an Act of Parliament could actually be struck down by a court was completely unheard of, was said to be impossible under UK constitutional system. Obviously, for instance, in the United States, the Supreme Court can declare law invalid if it is in violation of the Constitution. We don't have that in the UK. We never had that. The closest we've ever come to that really is European law. Up to a point, we now have it with the European Convention on Human Rights. But the main area in which we've had courts able to actually do this, and they have struck down on a couple of occasions acts of parliament that conflicted with the European law. That's the first time it's happened. So that just illustrates how far the European Union has reached into the domestic constitutional system. And therefore, if we're looking at the meaning of Brexit, again, an important part of that meaning is that we will have to disentangle a legal system that's been part of our legal system. It's been in a position of supremacy within our legal system since January the 1st, 1973. That's a lot of law. And one of the positions, and again, nobody really knows how exactly we're going to do that. If we do start making our own laws, how they will relate to pre-existing laws, and what happens to all the case law. Because if we're saying we're freeing ourselves from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, does that mean we're freeing ourselves from all the previous decisions by the European Court of Justice which were binding within the UK? Can we order judges to forget all of those decisions? I don't see how it will work. And clearly we're not going to change immediately every single law which is European in origin. It's very difficult to unpick which ones are European and which ones aren't European anyway. But even if we were going to try and do that, we wouldn't be able to abolish them all. Therefore, going forward, I suspect courts are still going to want to look at interpretations of those laws made by the European Court, even if we're not officially under the jurisdiction of the European Court. So it's going to be very, very complex how we disentangle all of that. And then that comes back to really the whole legitimacy of the referendum, because the referendum presented this as a kind of straightforward choice, what, yes or no, leave or remain. All these complexities, which even the greatest lawyers in the United Kingdom today are struggling to unpick, can't possibly have been in the minds of the electorate when they were choosing remain or leave. Whatever you may think about the decision, clearly there's a lot more in this decision than a simple choice between two options. So, but that's part of the domestic implications of leaving the European Union. Now I'm going to move on to the way in which the decision was taken, and I've just touched on that it was presented as this kind of binary decision between two options. And it's interesting how important referendums have come to be within the UK system. Before 1973, we had only used referendums really at local level, often in Wales when they were taking decisions about opening hours for pubs. They used to have a referendum at local level. That's the kind of decision for me. That's more appropriate kind of decision that you might want to take through a referendum. But then in 1973, referendums come more broadly onto the agenda. In Northern Ireland, in this instance, there's a referendum on whether or not Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom. In fact, everybody knew in advance what the result was going to be because of the balance of forces within Northern Ireland was well known, and hardly any Catholics actually took part in that vote because they saw it as illegitimate anyway. So in a way, that was a referendum almost to make a point, rather than a referendum to actually find out what people wanted to do. So the first real referendum was the one in 1975 on European Economic Communities. That shows again what an impact taking part in European integration has had on the UK, because they have to actually they have to start. That's when the referendums start. At the time, that was sold by Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister I mentioned earlier, as just being a one-off. We're going to have a referendum once. We're only doing it because it's a very, very unusual situation. It's never going to happen again, don't worry. Of course, then they start happening on other issues, and we have them on things like devolution in 1979, Scotland and Wales. We had them later on devolution again. We have a referendum again in Northern Ireland on the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So referendums become a kind of established part of our way of doing things in UK democracy. And in my view, that's quite a big change, because it does suggest a different approach to democracy. It suggests a shift more towards direct democracy and away from representative democracy. The implication is that if a decision's really, really important, Parliament isn't the proper place to take it, that representative institutions aren't good enough to do it. You need to have a referendum. But one problem with that is we don't have any clear rules on when you are and are not supposed to have a referendum, what issues do and do not require referendums, and there's not much consistency when you look at it closely over when they're held and when they're not held, other than there's been some very good reason involving the party that happens to be in government at the time needing to resolve an internal dispute. That seems to be the common feature to most referendums, rather than any real desire to have a proper democratic process. So that's part of the problem. And the other issue is that in holding a referendum, you're picking out one particular decision from a complex process of government and subjecting that to a different way of taking the decision. But you're leaving all the other decisions aside. And we've done this with the European Union referendum, because all we've asked people is, do you want to leave or do you want to remain? We haven't asked them anything about all the other subsidiary issues that follow from that, like, if we leave, what terms would you ideally like us to leave on? Do you want us to completely leave the single market? Do you want us to remain within the single market? Which priorities do you want to have us to have in a negotiating position? If the negotiations really don't go the way we wanted, are we allowed to perhaps think about not leaving? None of those questions were put. This is a simple leave, remain question. And you could argue that, some of the complexities I was talking about earlier, which I'm not blaming the public for not understanding them. I don't understand all of them. Nobody understands all of them. But it does call into question whether a referendum, rather than mechanisms of representative democracy, are the best way of taking this decision. But that's the way the decision was taken. And that leads on to, how is this decision actually going to be implemented, and who's going to implement it? The position of the UK government, which Theresa May made clear on her first speech to Conservative Party conference in October, is that now it's simply for the UK executive, the UK government, to do the negotiating and take us out, and importantly to activate Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union, which is the bit in that treaty that allows for member states to leave the European Union. The person who drafted that clause has recently said that it was drafted with the specific intention it would never be used. That they never actually intended it ever to be used. No one knows how it's going to work out really in practice. All we know is that the country that wants to leave has to activate it in accordance with its own constitutional processes, the wording, something like that. The problem is, in the UK, we don't know what our own constitutional processes are, because we haven't got a written constitution. But I'll get onto that in a minute. But then you get a 2-year period in which you negotiate the exit deal. Now, it says there may be some reference to arrangements that will follow the exit, but actually all it's really focused on is the exit deal, not what comes afterwards. So it may be that we're not even allowed to talk about what comes afterwards until we've dealt with just the immediate exit issues, because leaving the EU is such a complicated process for some of the reasons I've already said, that the idea that you could sort out the exit deal and the post-exit deal between the EU and the UK in 2 years is actually pretty difficult. And however, there is some provision for that 2-year period to be extended, although that will be subject to qualified majority vote by the European Council. And the final deal is also subject, I think, to qualified majority vote, and it's also subject to approval by the European Parliament. So it could be that we think we've got a deal and then somebody blocks it, quite possible. So all of those things have to be taken into account. Now, the government is saying, we're going to do this. We don't need to go back to Parliament. Parliament has no further direct role in any of this. We can just get on and do it. And also they said we're not going to provide a running commentary. So what exactly that means is not clear, but it sounds like they don't really want to tell us what's going on, and they don't want to they don't want to seek any further permission from Parliament. And the bit about excluding Parliament is quite interesting, in that one of the main arguments for leaving the European Union was it would be a way of restoring the sovereignty of Parliament, the authority of Parliament. Yet the actual leaving of it is apparently not something for Parliament really to be involved in. Now, all of that actually at the moment is subject to a legal challenge. So we'll see where that goes. And again, that's quite unusual in the UK for a legal challenge of that kind even to be mounted. We don't really do things through the courts constitutionally in that way, but we'll see where that all ends up. But that's the position of the government, and they're maintaining this position that they can actually completely control the triggering of Article 50 and negotiations that follow. So then I'll get on to, last of all, what might be coming next. What kind of exit might we get? I think, again, there was no indication from the actual question on the referendum ballot paper as to what exit might be. Certainly during the course of the campaign, there was a lot of discussion of the migration issue, of the idea that being in the European Union means we have to pull control over our borders. We don't have control over who's coming in and out of the country. We want to regain control. The lead slogan of the campaign was "Take back control," and it was heavily insinuated that one of the things we were going to take back control of was our borders, to be able to decide who comes into the country, who goes out again. How achievable any of that is, inside or outside the EU, is another debate. But again, it seems that the government have chosen to interpret the Leave vote as requiring whatever deal we do get to give us control of our own borders, as they would describe it. It's slightly an emotive description, but that's what they want to prioritise, that we actually get immigration policy repatriated to the UK, so it's controlled from within the UK. Now, the issue that raises is this: some people who either supported Brexit or willing to go along with it now were hoping that we would go more down the route that they have, say, in Norway, whereby they're not full members of the European Union, but they have access to the single market. But in return for access to the single market, they have to make various concessions, including incorporating European law into their law, and perhaps deals on freedom of movement. And if we want to be fully inside the single market, but not inside the EU, we may well have to accept freedom of movement, which means not having control of our own borders. So the problem there is, it may well be the case that if we really want to prioritise this migration issue, we're going to have to sacrifice access to the single market, which from an economic point of view, some people think is a real problem. That's one of the reasons why there's so much uncertainty. The value of sterling has overall gone down quite a long way since the referendum, that people don't really know what it's going to look like outside the EU, and it seems like the government is committed to what's sometimes called a hard Brexit, because some people on the pro-leave side are worried that although the government will make it look like they're leaving, they'll actually do some kind of a deal whereby we basically remain within but dress it up like we've left, which some people want that, but some people regard that as a kind of sellout of the vote. So that's what's going forward. So we'll see what happens there, but that's one of the problems we face. Now, finally, well, what does this all mean in a broader context? I mean, I know there's another political issue that's of great interest to all of you here today, and it's connected to this one in my view, in that we are seeing some of the more established ways of governing and some of the more what are described as the establishment or the traditional elites being challenged by more populist movements. I think that's going on in various different parts of the world. It's certainly happening, and there certainly seem to be common features across these populist movements. One is issues around migration. As I say, that was a big issue in the European referendum. It seems to have been an issue in the presidential campaign you've just had. And also the idea that there's a disenfranchised group at the bottom of society for whom the system isn't working, and who see a candidate or a cause they can vote for that will somehow be their way of registering discontent with the way things are run and the way things have been run for a long period of time. And that's why I drew a contrast with the 1975 referendum in Britain on the EEC, which was won by the Remain side, because they managed to create the impression that there's a mainstream of opinion. They had the mainstream media on board. They had the more mainstream figures in the different political parties on board. There had various public figures telling them vote to remain within the EU. They had various business leaders saying vote to remain within the EEC. It's the best thing, it's stability, it's good for all of us. And that worked. It didn't work in 2016. You had a similar coalition. The media were more hostile this time around, but you certainly had figures like the Archbishop of Canterbury being willing to say, even had David Beckham saying that we should stay within the European. Even that didn't work. So times have definitely, I mean, who wouldn't do what David Beckham told them to do? And you'd have thought it was his constituency, but it didn't work. It's an interesting contrast that these populist movements now, whereas once they've always existed, they come and go, but now they seem actually be able to actually win elections. And it may well be that some of the things that people who vote for these movements, some of their grievances against the system are entirely legitimate. There may be problems with the existing way of doing things. On the other hand, what's not as clear is what they're actually offering in place of what exists, or in place of what the elites have got to offer. And we've certainly seen that in the case of the European Union, where we got a vote, admittedly a narrow vote, but it was a majority of those who voted, 37% I think of those who could have voted, but it was a majority of those who voted, voting that they wanted to leave. But what's completely unclear then and remains completely unclear now is what that actually means next. Thank you. Yep, if people have got any questions and they don't want to go immediately, if you'd rather remain than leave, then...
Questions?
There's someone there? Yes, please.
So what do you think the likelihood of Scotland leaving the UK is, with Nicola Sturgeon having 56 MPs? Do you think Scotland now have more power to kind of put another referendum through as opposed to last time?
Well, that's a good, interesting...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. The likelihood of Scotland leaving, I think that first, whether or not there is a referendum is in the gift of the UK central government. At the moment, I think they're saying that they don't want there to be one, but obviously if there's evidence of a real groundswell in Scotland, then they may have to concede on that one. I'm not certain. I think certainly the UK leaving the EU would increase the chances of that referendum being held and being won by the independence movement. In some ways, I think it's a real challenge for the SNP because they're not going to be presented with a better opportunity to win an independence referendum. Therefore, if they don't manage to hold it, or if they hold it and don't win it, that's actually going to be a real setback for them. And it may be a bit like the situation in Canada where they call it the never-endum, don't they? They've had so many referendums now that it probably looks like the moment might have gone, although who knows, anything's possible. But I think the chances have increased, but also with that, the risks for the SNP have increased as well. And then it looks like they're really not, if they lose two referendums, then it might look like their moment's passed. So it's a crisis point for the union, but it's also a crisis point for the SNP as well in a different way.
Can you say a bit more about the recent court case and how that's ultimately going to get resolved there? And then also, if it turns out Parliament does get to play a role in this, do you have an idea of what role you think they're going to play? Will it be more of a soft Brexit rather than a hard Brexit? Or,
The court case, what might happen? The High Court have found against the government, which is significant in itself. It's going to appeal. The Supreme Court will hear it, I think, early December. I think it's going to be taking place. I honestly don't know what the outcome will be. If it does go to Parliament, then the issue is will there be just a parliamentary resolution, just a vote on a form of words in the House of Commons that will be possibly unamendable, so just be take it or leave it, or will the government actually have to take a bill through Parliament so they actually get statutory authority to do this? If they do that, the complication that then comes into play is the bill will have to go through not only the House of Commons but also the House of Lords, And the theory is, I don't know how true this is, that the House of Lords will be more resistant than the House of Commons. And they may not completely deny that the bill altogether, they may not block the bill altogether, but they may try and impose conditions either about going back to Parliament regularly for approval of the negotiating mandate, or for more of the running commentary the government said they don't want to provide. So that's an interesting area. But clearly the government, for whatever reason, really don't want to go back to Parliament, even though I suspect, my guess is Parliament would at the moment would say that, or certainly the House of Commons would say, we have to honour this referendum result at the moment. But I suppose what they're worried about is that there may be, rather than actually being directly rejected, there may be amendments and there may be discussions they'd rather not be having right now, partly because they've probably got a lot of arguments within the government itself. They don't want to add to that by having further arguments with Parliament when they haven't even got their own position sorted out yet.
Even if the Commons approve it and the House of Lords, it has to be approved by the court in Brussels. Could you expand a bit on the powers that Brussels have over accepting or rejecting?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Article 50 process, the negotiating mandate which the European Union takes, I think has to be approved by unanimity of the Council, and I believe by the Parliament as well. I believe that's what it says in Article 50. So that's the negotiating mandate. So actually that's the terms they go in on. Now obviously then they have a negotiation, but if they depart too far from the initial mandate, that's going to be a problem as well. So that's quite a high level of approval. And then the final deal, as I think I said, is subject to qualified majority voting and approval by the Parliament, and an extension of the length of the negotiating period beyond the 2 years is also subject, I think, to qualified majority of the Council. So there are lots of hurdles to be overcome, and it doesn't take very many member states to be unhappy with a particular stipulation in the deal for the whole thing to fall apart. So even aside from what bargaining position the UK takes, doesn't mean it's going to get what it's after, and there's lots of complications in there. And in terms of the court, I mean, the whole thing could end up in the European Court, but I think the UK government would be reluctant to do anything that involves going to the European Court, because their whole principle is we don't want to be subject to the European Court any longer. So we'll see how that plays out.
One last question, right there.
I mean, I'm happy to take the other question as well, if just, yeah. As well, I'm not saying instead of. Yeah. Haven't you heard enough of me over the last...
Is that me?
Yeah.
Do you think a majority of the British people are still in favor of leaving the European Union?
Very difficult to know. And again, in a majority of in favour of what kind of leaving of the European Union? Because of that 51.9%, probably not all of them favoured a hard Brexit. Some of them, a big chunk of them probably did. And then what of the people who didn't vote, do they regret it? So it was a majority of those who voted, but it was 37% of those who could have voted. So very difficult to say. We don't know. And that's, again, another problem with referendums, particularly when the result is close in those terms. It's a difficult one. And I guess the difference between a referendum and an election is that in 4 years' time you get another election, whereas with a if we're leaving the EU, it's much harder to reverse that. So if you've done it on quite a slim majority like that, you're taking an incredibly important decision that is very difficult to reverse. So that's why the narrowness in percentage terms is really significant in my view. Yeah, I'm happy to, if I don't want to.
So I read that there's an amendment to be considered by the European Parliament where individuals could opt in and maintain their EU citizenship and have access of freedom of movement and still vote in EU elections. Is that likely? Is that even a real thing? And if so, do you think a lot of people would choose to do that?
I would certainly do it if it was possible, but unfortunately, I just don't see how it could work, because if you're living in the UK you're going to have to be subject to the legal jurisdiction of the UK, and if the UK is not in the European Union, I mean, there's been discussion of things like, can somehow Northern Ireland and Scotland and Greater London remain within the EU? Well, but you know, that would involve building a big wall or something, which obviously is entirely a plausible project.
Could you possibly expand a little more on external effects of Brexit, like the possible contagion effect in Europe and the effect on development of radical political forces, such as Alternative of Deutschland in Germany or National Front EU in France?
Yeah, well, that's a good one. I mean, certainly Le Pen is kind of a supporter of Brexit for France, so it's part of a wider populist movement. I'm not saying all these movements are identical or that everyone who supports them is the same, but certainly I think there's a real potential that the UK could be contributing to a dangerous destabilisation of the European Union. There's no question about that. We can't pretend that's not a problem. And it's certainly one of the possible outcomes of all of this is a breakup in the European Union. Unfortunately, that's not out of the question. And I think in the UK we need to realise that's actually not such a good thing for us. It's not just a bad thing for the other European Union countries, it's a problem for us. The European Union, as I said at the beginning, came into being partly to stop wars in Europe. And, you know, all right, it might look like there's never going to be another war in Europe, but you know, you don't want to mess around with that. The European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize in, I think, 2012. I think it deserved it. I think if you look at the period during which it's been in existence, it's the longest uninterrupted period I can think of in European history when there hasn't been a major war in Western Europe. The closest really was, I suppose, former Yugoslavia, what's going on in Ukraine now. So things have happened, and what was going on in Northern Ireland, you might add as well. But it's been successful, I think, overall, if you look at what Europe's been like in the past. So to mess around with that is dangerous. So I think it could have a very, very negative impact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.